Hello to everyone. I'm Jessica Fiorillo. I'm the Executive Director of Harvard Education Press, and I welcome you to this webinar. We're really excited about this. The topic of our webinar today is Black Educators Matter. And we're here today with Dr. Tracey Benson and with Dr. Darrius Stanley to discuss the role and the importance of Black educators in our schools, in our communities, the impact that Black educators have on students of color, entire school communities, and the communities in which they exist, right? We'll also be talking about the significant challenges that Black educators face, what they're confronting, and the ways teachers and school leaders and community leaders can all help retain Black educators and support them in the work they're doing. So I'm going to go over some quick logistics for our session today, and then I'll introduce our discussants. So let's have that logistics slide. Okay, at the very end of the session, we'll have Q&A. And the way to, and you can enter your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen at any point throughout the session. Just jot something down if it occurs to you. Everyone's going to be muted during the session itself. The session is being recorded, and we will send the recording to everybody who is registered for attending here today. That will come up in a follow-up email in the next day or two. So thank you for coming. And now on to our amazing discussants, authors, and colleagues. So let me introduce you to Darrius Stanley first. Do we have a slide for Darrius? Ta-da! So Darrius Stanley is the author and editor of this just published, like hot off the press, new book, Black Educators Matter. We're really excited about this book and working with Darrius. So Darrius is an assistant professor of educational leadership and the Carmen Starks and Campbell Faculty Fellow of Innovation and Teacher Development at the University of Minnesota. Welcome, Darrius. And then I'll introduce Tracey. Tracey Benson is the author of one of our best-selling titles of all times, Unconscious Bias in Schools. He is also the founder and the CEO of the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute, which provides equity and unconscious bias training for educators. He has also, it seems, worked in practically every role that exists in education, I pretty much think. So thank you to Darrius and Tracey. Thank you to all of you for attending our webinar today. I'm going to step back now and turn off my video feed and let Darrius and Tracey do the talking, but I'll be back at the end to help run the Q&A session. So over to you guys. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm so glad to be in a conversation with you, Dr. Stanley, Darrius. You know, we met a number of years ago. I can't wait to get your book. I have it on the way. I didn't get a chance to read it. And for everyone who attended today. And so we have several things we want to talk about. But, you know, as we talked about in our prep meeting, to sort of introduce folks to who we are, our background, and what brings us to this work. So Darrius, do you want to start?
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you so much for the gracious introduction. And yeah, it was crazy how we are connected to one another in ways that, you know, sometimes we forget. So it's good to see you again, Dr. Benson, Tracey. But yeah, I'm really excited to have this opportunity to discuss something that's so near and dear to my own lived experience, as well as sort of my professional and academic journey and career. But I think that the notion of the personal aspirations to do this type of edited volume really comes from my upbringing. I was an educator, and I was born to be an educator before I knew I was born to be an educator. And I think that's a really important trait oftentimes among Black communities, is that you're shaped by folks you didn't know were shaping you in these very intentional ways. My mother was a Sunday school teacher at an old Baptist church in Tallahassee, Florida. And my grandmother was a librarian. My great aunt was librarians in segregated schools. And so growing up in that context and hearing about the stories of what it was like to go to segregated Black schools or be not allowed to attend schools that had better resources in Leon County, And in some cases, not allowed to attend school at all, right? Depending on how far back I go in my family's history. It was those intentional dialogues that I had with my ancestors and my elders um, that really pushed me into the field of education broadly. And it's those ideas and those memories and those commitments and those charges that really fueled this project um, in many ways. And I think about sort of also my experiences at my hometown HBCU. I went to Florida A&M University and didn't really intend to go into education, but felt sort of pushed and encouraged to do that work. Um, which led to a career in K-12 education, a brief career, and I'll talk more about that. But mostly, really walking into schools committed to exposing Black youth in particular to the contributions that we have made historically and continue to make in the field, as those are not the narratives that are taught in our social studies textbooks. And as a former social studies educator, I know that those narratives aren't in there. So there's a lot of nuance and dialogue that really fueled my efforts to be an educator and then eventually administrator for a short period of time. But on top of that, right, before I get too far into this, is acknowledging that the experiences that I had in school, um, experiences with racism, experiences with patriarchy, the experiences with exclusion and other forms of oppression, is why I felt that I needed to leave the classroom, I needed to leave K-12 schools to help do the work of thinking about how to design schools where my children, my newborn child, right, would be safe and would be uplifted. And as well as future educators that look like me, students that look like me, to not have those experiences. And so this book is sort of a further iteration of those traditions. And I'll sort of pass it back to you, Tracey.
Wonderful. And I think we share similar in terms of our background. My mother was a career counselor, and my father was a special ed teacher for, I think, 2 decades. And so I'm from a family of educators. I'm the only one of 6 who's actually in education. I think the other ones chose wisely. I chose a different path, but I think I was, again, born to be an educator. And I never quite understood why. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the question is always like, are there Black people there? Yeah, there's a lot of us in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but it's a very segregated city. For a while, we were the #1 segregated city in the US during the time which I was there. And I never understood why my parents stayed in Milwaukee public schools, because they had an opportunity to work in all types of schools with their experience, but they made a commitment to stay. I didn't understand that until I became an educator, until I worked in schools from the community that I was from, and realized just the ways in which we sort of accept the underserving, the ways in which we underserve these communities, because they are kids of color, because they are low-income kids, because they are kids who might be first or second generation in the country, that it's sort of an acceptable loss, and not understanding that at a young age, but realizing that when I became an educator. And also at the same time, being a larger Black man, going from being a teacher to being an AP to being a principal, understanding my place as a Black educator, that the same racism that affects the kids is the iteration of it that affects Black educators, right? When we're in these buildings, especially large Black men, that we are expected to be the saviors of the Black boys. And there's not a collective understanding around, we all own what is right for all of our kids, but you, brown person, you, brown man, come and fix these Black boys. And so that's an extra burden a lot of educators of color carry, especially when predominantly white institutions seek to hire more brown teachers. There's an unspoken expectation that you are now filling that space, which we feel that we don't own because we're not of the same skin color, but now we're going to pay you as a teacher, but yet you have this extra burden that we're going to expect, but not apply to you. And so that's the space in which I occupy in my work, especially around the idea of diversity, is like, what are we really asking for, and how does that double down on the oppression of educators of color? And so, being Black History Month, I think it's good it might be prudent to start with the historical context of the Black educator, just so we can remind folks that there was a rich history of the Black educator, and what that looked like, and why, and we might look like a different a cadre of teachers now. So would you like to sort of start there?
Yeah, I appreciate that setup. And I want to kind of sort of bridge a point that you made. I think it's so important to situate that this notion of the Black pedagogical kind, the typecast, the role entrapment that we walk into, right? And I think that's a good narrative to recenter just for a moment as we think about equity directors and these other sort of different roles that, right, are just disproportionately Black educators being, right, asked to do impossible, next to impossible work with no additional compensation, no recognition. So I just appreciate you sort of raising that point. Now, Tracy, you asked me a history question, and my undergrad's in history, so I'm gonna try my best not to spend too much time here. But I want to sort of take a step back, a couple steps back from where we normally start the conversation around Black educators, right? To just do a brief nod that, again, we had Black teaching and learning in Africa and ancient African civilizations, right? And ancient Kemet and the Western African civilizations, right? And that we built institutions and we built universities and we built mystery schools and we built educational spaces long before colonial preoccupation. And that tradition and that history often gets lost in the conversation about educators of color or Black educators. It's as if we didn't start teaching and learning until we got out of chattel slavery, right? And that's just not where I want to start sort of the historicizing of Black education or Black educators. But to that point, right? I think Black teaching and learning has always been part and parcel of our liberation fight and struggle and commitment, right? As Dr. Heather Williams and other scholars have talked about in self-talk, is that literacy has always been equated to this notion of liberation. We understood if we could learn to read, if we could learn to write, that we could liberate ourselves from the types of oppression like chattel slavery and other forms of dehumanization and anti-Blackness in this country, right? Like Frederick Douglass said, right? The more learned I became, the more dissatisfied I was with slavery, right? And I think that's really important to think about, and to think about the backlash of anti-literacy laws, right? And I think this is important to talk about, especially in the context of this particular book that talks about anti-Blackness and its tetheredness to white supremacy, in order to maintain the logics of white supremacy, right? In order to justify things like American chattel slavery, you have to exclude folks in very particular ways. And so what slave owners and planter society understood during this sort of period of chattel slavery in American history is that the Gabriel Prossers and the Nat Turners, right, and the Denmark Vesey's would organize and use Black teaching and learning strategies to provide an uprising against the particular system that was in play, right? And so you had to institute anti-slavery laws. You had to institute slave codes and Black codes to disallow the type of Black organizing and learning, right? But even in the midst of that, as Dr. Williams talks about in her book, that Black folks were learning on the backs of plantations by the shade of night and in shacks and in other spaces, right? And so I'm gonna pause there for a second, but just kind of just acknowledging that Black teaching and learning has this rich legacy and history that dates back even before, right, this period of chattel slavery and through that.
Yeah, and that's something I have to recommend that, yeah, again, slavery wasn't introduced by the colonizers, right? We weren't uneducated folk that we brought over here that got entered in. I love it that you don't just say slavery, say chattel slavery. And that's very particular to the Western world, right? That invention of not just you, but your whole lineage and legacy will be born and die under legacy over the course of generations. And the introduction of education with the Native Americans from the colonizers, and also with African American imported Africans, right, under slavery, that education was a weapon. That was its primary goal of the origins of education in this country. That when it came to Native Americans, the ones they could annihilate and eliminate, they sought to forcefully assimilate through education. That was the primary vehicle to steal their culture, their language, ways of being, knowing, and doing, and indoctrinate them into the European way of thinking, which is install a colonial mindset within these Native Americans. And then when it came to the imported Africans, the ones who are subject to chattel slavery, was we're going to keep it from you, right? Because we know the power, we know you're learned people, we know that if we gave you the tools to know how to navigate our society, that you might then ingest this and figure out how to exist within a new society that we've created, but we must keep that from you.
Yeah.
And iterations of chattel slavery have not gone away, right? It might not look like Black folks on a plantation picking cotton, under extreme conditions, but we do accept Black and especially um, Black people, Black individuals of low income and low income communities. We do accept substandard service, right? We're going to keep you in your neighborhoods. We're going to keep you under oppressive conditions. We're going to keep you in underserved schools. We're going to keep you away from a viable medical system. That's all legacies of chattel slavery that we continue to accept. And individuals often, when we talk about how could people back in the day live and accept, even those who didn't own slaves, accept that being a part of society, we have to understand that we're accepting an iteration of that right now.
Yeah, and it's the difference that process. Scholars talk about it all the time. Black scholars in particular. It's different between education and schooling, and I think that's part of what you're talking about in that other piece about how do we use education as a weapon, right, to then colonize and further exclude and disenfranchise, right? And that this notion of schooling is fixated in many ways on maintaining sort of the types of hierarchies and forms of disenfranchisement that we're seeing, right? And that's true across the board. We're to your point, we're willing to accept, right, or not even question the fact that children who are experiencing poverty or Black children who are concentrated in neighborhoods that have had the economic floor pulled from them, right, or closings of Black schools. We're willing to accept that. That's fine, right? We don't even question it anymore. It becomes sort of a consistent sort of like misnomer in some ways. Well, they'll figure it out. But I think again that's that important division between schooling as a process to maintain American society versus education as a form of liberation is where we have to have a conversation, right? And I think that's the nuance as when we talk about Black educators historically, that they've been able to draw those lines and understand the nuances between those two pieces.
Right. And a lot of folks who are in my community who are Black educators, we have ingested that legacy, right, of coming to service for the liberation of our people. And we often don't understand, even post-emancipation, Black people sought to be educated. We created our own schools, our own communities. We taught our own kids, right? Even under substandard conditions, right? Where we weren't allowed entrance into white universities, entrance into white schools. We still created a vibrant education culture within our communities that, there's a documentary called Wilmington Burning, right? That I think everyone should watch about these vibrant Black communities across the US that gained access to our own governance within our segregated communities, our own system of education. We had tens of thousands of Black educators that served in our schools, that represented us, that served us within our communities, that we forget that there was purposeful erasure of the legacy of the Black educator via the Brown versus Ford decision. And folks often don't understand, like, this was one, I mean, we can get into the legalities of it. Like, I don't think it was an actual attempt to outlaw segregation, to purposely desegregate, in all due time, and yet it hasn't happened. But an offshoot of that was the sort of the usurping of this space that Black educators occupied to instantly discredit them from being allowed to teach. And this happened to tens of thousands of teachers, of administrators, to evolve to what we see today, the absolute absence of Black teachers within our own communities, because it was an effort to purposefully erase and replace with white women who were leaving the home to work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll never forget my great aunt, who I referenced earlier. She was one of the first Black librarians in Leon County, Florida. And she would always say this to me. She said, you know, one of the worst things that ever happened to our community is that Brown decision, that desegregation of schools. They just closed all of our schools, right? And there's certainly some nuance, but I understood where she was coming from. Because what you saw was not just schools closed, right? And not just Black teachers being fired and demoted, right? And not just Black leaders being fired and demoted. You look at Dr. Fenwick's text, right? But the communities starting to lose these salaries, right? Up to millions of dollars estimated in salaries, right? That was the middle class job in Black communities across so many states, across so many communities, right? And to lose that sort of economic power, that political power, right? And having to find new careers, right? You see places, at least in my hometown, you see Black communities that were well established, but after the 54 decision slowly start to erode. Things like, and then state sanctioned efforts to double down on that, like eminent domain and a host of other, right, housing-based policy issues that we don't have enough time to talk through. Again, you see the disintegration of Black spaces and Black communities on the heels of the Brown decision and other desegregation efforts. And to your point earlier, I mean, I think that's important. It was never about, right? People didn't want to be in classrooms with Black students, and you can see that across the South when you see these rise of segregation academies, right? I always challenge my students when I'm teaching a course on race and education is like, look at the years of X, Y, and Z Christian school in this Southern state. What years were they founded, right? And it's consistent, 1955, 1962, right? It always aligns with whenever the speed of desegregation, right, happened in that particular community or state.
Right, it's purposeful, right? And I wrote a chapter on SROs, right? And SROs, the proliferation happened post 54, right? And it started in the Midwest around, well, we want to keep order and safety within schools because we were desegregating. Now it's evolved into part and parcel of the school to prison pipeline. And we're using the violence in schools that are mostly, perpetuated in terms of like large scale school shootings by white males. But yet we use that thought process and that phenomena to place in Black and brown schools, right? Because it's one where we want to continue to use these spaces as carceral spaces because we believe these communities need to be controlled. And so even within this context, we have the legacy of the Black educator that's still there, that's still heeding the call, that's still entering these environments and still functioning, that we understand the legacy of the Black educator and pushing forward within environments that are still not welcoming to our epistemology of understanding why we're there and why we are pushing forward in a way that's beyond a curriculum, that's beyond a pedagogy, that sees a path forward for our community. And so how does that work for you in your work, and how do you see that in terms of your own personal work, but also how you write about the call to act out for liberation, and then having to exist within a system that devalues us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a very important sort of reminder. I think is that I walked into education with a different question and a different mission than a lot of my colleagues that I worked with. That I just was there for a different reason, right? And I think that is often perceived in schools, and I'll talk about my own personal experience, as different and therefore deviant, right? As outside of the norm of the space, right? I remember I was in a teacher evaluation meeting after observation, and I was sort of ad-libbing a bit in class because again, you know how it is. Teach history, and 95% of your class is Black, right? And the history that is in that chapter, not what you're going to teach those kids. It's just not going to happen, right? And I was chastised in my meeting for not teaching, for not following the quote unquote learning goals from these theorists who have no interest in the liberation of Black people, right? And this is not a discount on Dewey and Piaget, Vygotsky, or what have you, right? But those logics weren't in there. They weren't in those pedagogical. That pedagogical knowledge was not interested in the emancipation and liberation of Black, right? And so I understood that walking into the classroom, and I knew I had to, in many ways, circumvent that sort of pedagogical practice to do what my students needed in terms of what they needed to learn and how they needed to learn more particularly, right? And so when I say something like, Black educators matter in my writing, it can sound gimmicky, but it's really an intentional move to rehumanize Black educators, right? And to move beyond the scripts and the narratives where you have to do this thing, you have to be the disciplinarian, you have to control the unruly Black, like you talked about before, right? And to remind ourselves of the call for liberation, the call for uplifting Black folks, the call for educating Black students to navigate school spaces, right? Because that is the system that we are forced to deal with and to wrestle with, but also to imagine something bigger and greater and beyond, right? As Dr. Siddle Walker talks about when she writes about their highest potential, she says that those Black educators, the reason why they were so important and so special is because they designed school spaces that allowed students to imagine worlds that didn't exist yet, right? In the 1930s and 40s, right? And that's the type of work that a lot of Black educators, including my colleagues and including the folks who contributed to this text, are committed to doing in schools and in school spaces. It's that call, to your point, that ministry, to your point, right? That is so unique to the Black experience, I would argue.
Yes, absolutely. And I interviewed on my podcast Dr. Philip Smith, and he writes about he writes about Black male leaders and leading as ministry, right? Meaning that we're envisioning a world not just in school, but a world beyond, right? What needs to be in terms of continuing the legacy of liberation, right? Via education within the spaces among our Black kids, right? And I find that leaders, and as a leader myself, that it involves, as you say, from the classroom all the way up to the leadership end, it involves countercultural thinking, where your surrounding environment is not going to celebrate you, right? Especially if you're one of a very few, right? Because the system is set up to produce the outcomes it produces. It's set up to produce overrepresentation of Black kids in exclusionary discipline. It's set up to over-refer Black kids to special education. It's set up to push kids out of school early and have heightened dropout rates among Black communities. It's set up to do that, right? And when interrupting that, I find, especially among new leaders, I coach a number of new leaders who spent the majority of their time in their classroom as these liberatory educators, who then transition to leading the school, right? That you have a wide swath of individuals who are teaching in the classroom, mostly white women. And not to say good or bad, but the epistemology is not the same, and it's surprising, right? The realization that the system is not set up is not a viewpoint that everyone shares or can't even believe, right? It's easier to say these populations don't fit here. We need to help them change to fit more into our system and structures so they can be successful. And then there's sort of using the example, be more like Billy. He was a Black boy who he was on the honor roll. Be more like him, assimilate like him. And I think with all the best of intentions, but that using that anecdote in and of itself is to say your worth and you're bringing your culture and ways of being as a Black person in this building, right? That the majority aren't successful, but Billy, who assimilated, is. And as a leader, to absorb that, I think what teachers don't recognize that, one, that it's deficit thinking according to the rest of the Black population, but also that it's directly violent to the Black face that they're talking to, right? So yeah, that phenomena of the constant micro and macroaggressions within the environment is something that can be remedied with a greater conversation around the space that Black educators occupy currently.
Yeah, absolutely. And so much of this notion of sort of freedom dreaming or imagining anew is so necessary, because even when you play the game, this is what I argue to folks all the time. When you do the work of assimilation, when you do the respectability politics, right? The outcome on the back end of that for Black students, right, is never equal to that of your white colleagues or white students, right? It never does, right? And I always use this experience that I've almost forgotten, but my dad reminds me all the time. He said, you took that gifted exam at elementary school at least 5 times. And the teacher would always meet with us after that and say, he only missed it by 1 point. He only missed it by 2 points, right? And I use that example oftentimes in class because it's like, now here I am in theory, right? Not knowingly, but simulating, meeting the standard that you set for me, right? And then you find different ways to move the goalposts every time I get closer, right? Every time I inch towards that, oh well, you have to do this extra thing, right? And so again, the maintenance of white supremacy through our institutions, through our institutional logics, which I write about, and the commitment to seeing the Black as unable and ineducable and subhuman or less than human or excluded from our spaces, right, is a constant narrative that, to your point, has to be interrogated. When we look at our colleagues who may not look like us, right, who are walking into schools, assuming that, to your point, everything is on the up and up, and if you just do this thing, right, we'll meet those goals that we set.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And knowing full well in the broader context, right, that, as educators, we're still people too, right? Outside of the school building, we're still people too. And recognize that we often make very clear racialized decisions, and when I'm talking with teachers and leaders, doing some professional development, like we have to scale back and realize that a lot of our decisions we make in our regular lives are very racialized. We decide where we live, often based on race. Got a lot of these teachers who are working in my schools that are living in my community, right? If you're a white woman, you're working in these predominantly, I don't see you living in my community. You're living more in the white community, right? You're shopping at the white stores. You're sending your kid not to the school in which you work, because we would never do that. My kid won't go here. Let's send them to the other school, right? So these decisions are very racialized in a very real way, good or bad. I'm not casting aspersions on the decisions we do make, because there are very real implications for that. But remembering that these preferences make its way into our schoolhouses and into your classroom. Just because you make the decision out there in your regular life, don't think you don't carry that same mindset into the classroom.
Right.
And so I know that you have a new addition to your family. I have two. I have one that's 22 and one that's 2, right? And my oldest is a Black boy. And his experience was eerily familiar as mine, because I was in Milwaukee, but my mother chose to enroll us in what's called the 220 program. It's a program to integrate the suburban schools, because our local school, it was known as a dropout factory. So myself, my 5 brothers and sisters, we were bussed out to Brown Deer, Wisconsin, and that's the double-edged sword for Black parents. We got to pick our poison, right? Because we know if we want our kid to be surrounded by more Black and brown kids, Black kids that look like us, and might be in a school that's not as well resourced. Now, if we send our kids to a school that's more well resourced, depending on where we are, it might be a predominantly white school where they're going to have to absorb more microaggressions, more racism. And so we often have to pick our poison and support it from there. And so when I'm thinking about my son's experience, I sort of took on the hat of what my parents did for me. I was the advocate. I was in the classroom. I was constantly wearing my nicest clothes, going to meet with teachers, because I know as a Black parent, they see me in a particular way as well, right? And dreaming forward, knowing the particulars of the schooling experience. One, I would love for my son to have had more Black teachers. I don't think he had a single one, right? And then also thinking about what we want to dream forward for our kids within these spaces. I'm thinking about that for my 2-year-old, right? Because she'll be going to school in 3 years. So what should that look like? And what should our influence be as folks who are interested in providing a better experience for our kids within the schoolhouse? You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate how you frame that, and I'm gonna have to hit you up later to talk through this, because this fatherhood journey is Black fatherhood journey is something else, and I'm only a bump in. But yeah, even in trying to identify daycare spaces, right? What are these sort of epistemological? I'm paying all this money, right? What are the epistemological and ideological stances of the daycare providers that I'm going to leave my child with between the hours of 8 and 6 so that I can go do my job, so that I can afford to pay for this place, right? And that's a new question, right? But I harken back to 2 things, right? It's the same fuel, effort, and commitment that I have for Jesse and Juan, my classes. It's the same sort of ethos and perspective that I want to bring to my own child's experience, and that is I have to be a fierce advocate, right? And I have to be attentive to the nuances of what it is that they will experience more than likely, and the challenges that they'll experience that I didn't experience, and how to help them navigate that space, right? And I'll never forget my classroom, we taught a lot of social studies. And when I moved into sort of administration roles and deanship work, we talked about what happened in class. But that space was more so beyond the containment space that they wanted it to be, right? It was a space for students to actually have a voice and dialogue. And oftentimes those students were Black. And oftentimes, more than likely, those students were Black males, right? And oftentimes we would have conversations about just life. Like, this is what's going on in my life. And some of the stories, I'm sure you've heard it, is like, well, I understand why you tapped out of this learning experience for 50 minutes. That actually made a lot of sense to me. I would have done the same thing, right? And so it's those kinds of things of hearing these kids out, hearing them out, and trying to protect them and advocate for them at different levels that I think about now as a parent, right? A little bit different than being an educator, in ways that I hadn't I think had thought about before when I was teaching students, and I think that prepared me actually to be in this particular position where I am today. But to a larger, broader point, right? I always go back to history, and I always go back to Du Bois. One of my favorite articles that he wrote was the 35 article, "Does the Negro Need Separate Schools?" And I think his analysis. I love how he brought it together. But the summary, for those who haven't checked it out, is just there's no panacea in either one, right? Am I going to choose to live in the place where I know there are Black teachers in Black neighborhood? There are challenges there because of the way state sanctioned violence works, right? Am I going to choose the suburban space where I know there are more white teachers, but there are greater quote unquote ratings at this school, right? There are significant challenges there. I lived that, right? I know what that is. And he boiled it down to a couple of things that I think are really important. He says, first off, if a child goes to a mixed school where he's taught every day, he eats and drinks daily the idea that he is inferior, they are inferior, she is inferior, then that's not the school for that child, period and point blank, right? If a child attends a school that doesn't have the resources they need to attain the type of education they need to navigate society, then that's not the ideal space either. But at the end of the day, right, if you can meet a child where they are and center their humanity, sympathy, and knowledge and truth are the terms of use, right? That is the best space for nurturing and developing and uplifting Black students. And I think we get so caught up, right, in ratings and is this school diverse, right? Or is this school have Black teachers? And it's right. It actually isn't about any of those things singular, right? It's about are we designing and co-designing school spaces with students, with communities, with Black educators, with liberation-minded Black educators in particular, that meet the needs and see the humanity of Black youth and not sort of their persistent sort of carceral state that we try to place them in, the containment state that we try to place them in. So those are the kinds of things that I think about now that I hadn't, thought about as intently as I did in previous times.
Wonderful, wonderful. And the question I get, because I think we're going to go to Q&A a little while, is, folks who have these, DEI intentions around bringing in liberation-minded Black educators, right? And there are very discrete ideas about how to do that. How do we diversify with care, right? Especially in places where there aren't very many, or if any, Black educators, but we need at least one or two, right? Which is a problem in and of itself. So, I receive this question a lot, right? And I do a lot of commentary around, the sort of the technical move, like, let's just get some more what I call brown people walking around, right? And then we've achieved our DEI goal. We're diverse, we have more brown, but I'm just like, you're bringing them more proximate to the racism in your school in the first place. There's a reason they're not there, right? But we just want to bring them in and keep them. And so what would you say are some of the, I wouldn't say, top, just one or two pieces of advice for folks who are actively on this journey to diversify via bringing Black educators to their building? How do they diversify with care, and what structures and practices are necessary to
Yeah.
sustain the drive and not be as Goldie, as Bettina Love says, what's the phrase? I'll remember in a minute. Like soul stealing or something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, you understand
Oh, yeah,
the nature of the question. So
yeah.
what are your
Spirit
thoughts?
murder. Yeah.
Spirit murdering. There you go.
Yeah. No, I think that's a beautiful question. I get asked that question all the time, and it's very difficult to answer, even in an entire chapter that I wrote in this book about it. Very difficult question to answer because there's so many leaky spots in this work, leaky parts of the pipeline. But I think it begins with something we talked about earlier: is you have to humanize Black educators, right? They are not pawns to be positioned in disciplinary roles or equity roles or these uncompensated spaces, right? So that we have to start there with shifting the logics that we operate from that see Black educators, as Anthony Brown calls it, these typecasted Black pedagogical kinds, right? Typecasted roles to control and contain, right? So it starts there. But I also think too that so much of this work is rooted in, as my grandmother would always say, you got to clean up your own house before you go to somebody else's, right? And I'm paraphrasing. But there are systems and logics and processes within schools, to your point earlier, why Black teachers, which are the reasons why Black teachers aren't there, right? We don't commit to changing the conditions. We just want to have a new recruitment campaign, right? Oh, we got to get diversified in school. We don't change the conditions of the schools. That's the problem, and that's where I start a lot of my work. Is like, no, it's the everyday experiences. It's the broader policies, but it's the nuances and the experiences of my everyday, where I am told every day in my PLC meeting or implicitly when I'm walking down the hallway that I am a less capable teacher. I'm told that by the resources I'm getting. I'm told that by the classes I'm forced to teach. I'm never seen as a gifted educator or an IB or an AP educator, right? I'm never put in those roles. Go into school today and see how many AP teachers are Black, right? How many gifted or IB teachers are Black, right? So I know I'm embarking on coming up on time. Yeah, but I think too, it's about changing the institutional conditions and seeing Black educators as intellectuals and instructional leaders and these other leaders that are beyond, right, disciplinarians and controlling and containment, right? That's where it starts. But I also think it's something, this notion of school boards are still critical in hiring processes, right? And you don't always center them in the conversation around equity leadership. And Dr. Sean Joseph writes a really good chapter in this book about his experiences as a Black superintendent, where he talks about what we have to talk about the local level district policies around hiring and retention as one of the starting points. We miss that a lot. And I think that's a good space to start. Is are school board members getting the type of equity training they need, right? Are they getting the type of intentional policy analysis work that they need to do to make sure that the types of things that we have in place are attractive to and are able to sustain Black educators in school, right? So I'll kind of stop at that point.
And I'll just move us into questions because I think the line that you're going is exactly the line that our listeners really want to hear more about. So we got some really good questions, and one of them is about how can white teachers and other educators of color work together to create an environment? Like how do you create some solidarity that helps solve problems at the teacher level, I think is what this question's getting at.
I'll let you take it one, Dr. Stanley. I'll follow you up if I have something to add.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Big question. I always say this conversation starts in the teacher's lounge, right? And I remember my experiences in the teacher's lounge. This child is this, and this child is that. This child is not, right? And I think those sort of deficitizing narratives become part of the everydayness of schools. It's part of how we think about things, whether we're conscious of it, right? Going back to Dr. Benson's work is different, but it's so quick off the tongue to deficitize a Black child, right? I know in Dr. Warren's latest book, right? We don't see possibility in Black kids, right? We immediately go to what they are not capable of, right? And he asked that different question, is like, well, what if we started off with what they were capable of? What if we started off with what's possible and the potential of these, right? What they already have, right? And if you immediately register that, everything you do in that day would look different. Everything you do in that school would look different. The way you would write that learning goal, the way you would write that lesson plan would look fundamentally different if you assumed an asset and not a deficit, right? And I think that sort of intellectual or cognitive sort of shift is where that solidarity can grow from there, right? But you got to begin with that. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I want to add on to that is sort of recognition and acknowledgement of the sort of untaught knowledge of the educator of color who chooses to opt in to the sort of solidarity work, right? It should not be expected unless it's in the job description and the educator is duly compensated for playing that role. It should not be expected for the educator of color to partner with the white educator to help educate, right? But if there's someone chooses to lean in and chooses to be a partner in the work, we got to recognize the knowledge rate and the depth of knowledge as being a person of color who's gone through the school system, the depth of knowledge that we have as far as owning this identity to add to the conversation, right? And we have to think about it in terms of like other identities. And so if I'm going to partner with someone, I'm a straight cisgendered man, someone who's of the LGBTQIA identity, as someone who I'm going to partner with to help the LGBTQIA community, I'm going to give more credence to their depth of knowledge because they've gone through the experience as a student in schools. If I'm going to partner with someone who has a particular disability and I'm going to partner with them to help students with disabilities, I'm going to give credence to their depth of knowledge, right? And take from them and learn from them from their experience. Same thing goes for educators of color. That if you're stepping in as a white educator and say, I want to be a part of, I want to be an accomplice, not an ally. I want to be an accomplice to help liberate our Black students from this environment. I need to give credence to your knowledge. That means that if I need to point out your racism, if I need to point out your deficit framing, and if I need to probe how you are describing these kids in terms of being the savior, we have to be able to receive that because we have a depth of knowledge that you do not have. And so that involves a tremendous sense of humility and also understanding that they're to be giving credence to the knowledge base that Black educators have beyond what's in books.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a follow-up, sort of a follow-up question on that is, so if you're a Black educator and you are considering a position that's open in a predominantly white school district, what would you be looking for to make a shift to that school or school district appealing to you? So I'm sort of flipping the question in the comments that came through about what can a school district do to be more inviting to Black educators, but what as a Black educator would you want to see in a school district to make you think I could go there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. Now, personally, right, and I'll just say this: I wouldn't necessarily make that choice explicitly. That wouldn't be the reason I made that choice, right? Because it was where it was. But I also think this is better suited for folks who are still in working out in the K-12 system. But broadly speaking, I think the first thing I want to see, right, is a commitment, at least, right, in name, right, and structures to follow up and sustain the work of racial equity, because I can work from there, right? But when those policies and structures aren't in place already, right, this probably isn't the space that I need to be in, right? It's hard enough to do the work anyway, so I need something that operates in some ways as a vehicle to accelerate the type of work that I want to do, and that's a sort of a broader point that I would raise.
Yeah, I would say likewise that there's a commitment and at least acknowledgement that I'm bringing you into a racially hostile environment. You know, I am aware. I might not have the full depth of knowledge on what your experience is going to be here, but I know there are no Black people here, right? And the ones that have come have left, right, in the past. And we haven't done our due diligence on really diving into why we haven't been able to retain Black educators, but we have to acknowledge there's something about the environment that is not inviting, that's pushing Black educators out. And there we need to have a very intentional avenue for not if racism shows up, but when? And how are we going to address that? Not leaving you out there to address that as an individual in sort of your own liberation, but how do us as your white accomplices protect you from the inevitable when you enter this space? That's what I would be looking for. A commitment to that, the verbiage explicitly of that, and the follow through.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the role, how students can drive a change in a school toward more more opportunity for their liberation? I'm just curious. I loved your discussion about changing the curriculum because it didn't cover what you wanted to cover in a chapter, and you wanted so. I think a lot of that is knowing your audience, right? And what they want to hear and what they need to hear to grow and feel powerful in their role as students. Is there a role for students in supporting and driving and asking for this change? Or is that not something students should have to do?
I think it's so interesting. We design schools for students and communities, right? Without them. And it's the wildest thing to me is that, we continue to do this year after year, saying that we care about student voice, saying that we care about Black communities, right? And we continue to create schools that disenfranchise and exclude them. It's a wild thing, right? And I don't know what it's going to take for us to really interrogate that. I actually thought the pandemic might be an opportunity for us to rethink. And in that context, people were rushing back to get back to the same logics, right, that didn't work in the first place, right, again. And so I think, to your question of should it be students' responsibility, I struggle with that being the framing of it, but I would say students should have agency in the types of educational experiences that they have. And so if we're talking specifically about the connections between Black communities, Black students, and Black educators, right? I mentioned Dr. Siddle Walker's work on purpose because what those schools did, those value segregated schools were able to do was to collectively co-design the education experience, right?
Yeah.
While also meeting the standards, quote unquote, of the state. They were doing both. But what they understood is that in a segregated Jim Crow society, I don't have access to the extracurriculars. I don't have access to the best textbooks. I don't have all those things. So we have to work together as a community, right? There was a commitment to communalism. We have to work together as a community to leverage all of our expertise to design what this education experience looks like. We're not there anymore, right? We're not there anymore. Students are the last folks we ask. Communities are the last folks we ask. They find out after the fact if we ask them at all. And so I think that is part and parcel of our sort of American education system, and one of the things that have to be interrupted if Black educators are to really matter, right? That's necessary.
Tracy, anything to add there?
Yeah, and I think we already know, what the avenue is for enhanced student engagement and community engagement in sort of shaping the school, because we know who has power. Being an administrator, like we listen to the high-income white parents who have the option on whether to come to the public school or not. That's who controls policy. That's who controls access to courses. That's who controls the conditions of the school. We listen to those parents and those kids because we value those communities more the way in which schools are structured. We want to hold on to you. We want to attract you in. We want to offer coursework that's consumate to what you expect. And it's got to be away from Black people. It's got to be on a different course and a different trajectory. They control the environment. Now, we just have to take the same archetype of what we built for these valued communities and apply that to the Black and Brown community. We already have the blueprint, and we just got to ask ourselves, why do we not value the Black community, which we often see as like our captive audience? They're coming here anyway, and hence they don't have to have voice. Or we might give them voice just as surface. We're going to hear from you, but we can't really follow through because you're asking for radical change. But radical change is necessary.
I would love to get to two more questions. We have a really great question here saying this work can be really emotionally draining and traumatizing. Do you have advice for recharging when leading this work as a Black educator? Because because of the disruption in our systems are a matter of urgency. What helps recharge? I guess what helps you going? This is hard work. How do you deal with it? Just the emotional exhaustion of dealing with it.
You want to jump on that, Tracey?
Yeah, and this is going to sound, so I wrote a paper called Nobody's Mule. It follows one Black, liberation-minded Black woman who went from position to position, still serving in the capacity of educator. And what I found through her story is also mirroring to my story, meaning that I intended full and well to remain an educator for my career, and I have in different iterations. Like during the introduction, Jess, I've had every different position. But what I think the biggest in terms of someone who's liberation minded, who's an educator, the most revolutionary thing we can do is survive and stay in the work. And so if that takes an environment that's taking away your mental health, your physical health, and being socially emotionally draining, do not be afraid to choose another environment, right? To start anew and create other conditions, right? Because I know the first schools I was in, I didn't know enough about being an educator to create the condition to make it sustainable. So I moved to another location, and then coming in, sort of set the bar a little bit higher, and then a little higher, and a little higher around creating an environment that could sustain me, and I could inform the environment so that I could be emotionally and physically healthy in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just sort of jump on that real quick. This is just a thought that I just had. Maybe, I think Black educators in K-12 spaces also need some form of sabbatical. We need time away, right? And I think that would have helped me recharge for sure, right? But I think sort of having a racial realist perspective helps. And I didn't have that early in my career in the way that I have it now in the academy. Is that these institutions are never going to see me, right, in the way in which I see myself. And in some ways that is comforting in the sense that I'm not expecting something of my school space, right? I'm not expecting it to do what it just cannot do and is not committed to doing. And I think that is where some of the exhaustion comes from, is you keep waiting for the school, waiting for the organization, the institution to love you back, and it just doesn't. It doesn't, right? And so in thinking about that, it's not a clean solution, but it does sort of cure some of the paranoia you have in that wait period that you have. Like, man, I just really wish they'll see me for who I am. It's not going to do that.
Can we end on I love your chapters, Darrius, on hope for the future. Can we sort of end on some of what the vision is and strides that you see happening, and why should we be hopeful? The dreamers.
Yes, I mean, I think our history tells us that Black educational freedom dreaming is part and parcel of our experience, and that the same dreams that my ancestors had on plantations are the same dreams I have for my own children, right? And that I am in a progressively better space than before, and that Black folks always have had to rely on hope. And I think hope is a very important point and distinction. It is distinct from optimism. I always say optimism suggests that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I can see it, I can touch it, I can feel it, and I know what it is. But freedom dreaming and hope are different, because there may not be a reason in that particular context to be optimistic about anything, right? But I gotta hope that there's something on the other side of this, and that gives me the space and the freedom to dream of something beyond white supremacy, beyond patriarchy, beyond other forms of oppression. And I think that is where I remain hopeful, is that I always have time, at least while I'm here, to imagine and dream worlds. Black educators across K-12 and K-20 pipeline have time and space to dream and imagine worlds that don't look like this, right? And that it doesn't have to be pretty and tight both, right? But it gives us the space to do the type of dreaming that we want. And this book was an example of that, right? In many ways. So
Yeah.
I remain excited for those reasons.
Any thoughts, Tracey, on that before we wrap it up?
Yeah, and it goes back to sort of thinking about the dream of the little boy under chattel slavery in the midst of 246 years, 150 years in, that had no realistic sense of making it out of chattel slavery, but the dream in bed about what could be. Could I be in the house? Could I not have to work the fields? Could I not see my parents whipped and chained? Could I not, could I walk freely, on the road and not be owned by someone? So that dream has come to fruition. And we have to understand that centuries of oppression that we have lived through in this country have come to dissipate, but it's taken time. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of oppression are not going to get solved overnight. But the liberation has been from purposeful efforts of individuals just like ourselves who are doing this work. And so the hope comes by me playing my part. The dream that that little boy in his cot in chattel slavery had for where I am now, my dream will be even larger from what I can imagine 100 years from now, because it's taken that long to get here. And if I play my role, it might be a different future 100 years from now.
Oh, I love that. And we are out of time, but I just have to say, we are so grateful to publish your books and to offer sort of the world your visions for what the future could be, where we are, where we've been, and where we can get to. So thank you so much for being our panelist today. This was such a great discussion. And I just want to let everyone know that please visit our website. There's a code here that will give you a 25% discount if you want to buy Tracey's book and Darrius's book. These are books that can change the world, and the more people have them in their hands, the better. And we're just really glad to be a small part of that here at Harvard Education Press. But thank you very, very much to Darrius and Tracey. Thanks.
Thank you.
And everyone have
Thank
a
you.
lovely evening, and thank you for coming.